Good evening, sleeper of stories. As you nestle into your quiet space tonight, please remember to like, subscribe, and share just before you drift away. Dim the lights. Let the hum of your thoughts grow still. Tonight's tale brings us to the crossroads of Celtic belief and the natural world mystery and meaning braided into one. Episode 8 begins now. I'll tell the story of two efforts by the English to conquer Celtic-speaking countries, Wales and Ireland. I'll spend more time on Ireland in this lecture, but in order to set the scene for the Irish invasion, we need to start off with the Welsh one. But have no fear, the Welsh will get a whole lecture of their own. Let's start with a very quick overview of relations between the Welsh and the English, from the period after the Anglo-Saxon settlements in the 5th and 6th centuries down through the 12th century. As I explained in my lecture on Britain after the end of Roman rule, the Anglo-Saxons advanced from east to west across Britain, but they were stopped short in the West Midlands at what we now know as the boundary with Wales. Over the next few hundred years, the Welsh princes continually raided the English, and were raided in turn, but they sometimes allied with one English ruler against another. For example, the famous King Oswald of Northumbria, who was later revered as a saint, was killed in a battle against his English enemy, the pagan king of Mercia, and Mercia's Welsh allies. But the Welsh did not maintain this alliance with Mercia. During the 8th century, the military threat from Wales was great enough that the Mercian king Offa built a huge dike to try to prevent Welsh attacks. Substantial portions of this dike can still be seen today as a testament to the healthy respect that the English had for the fighting prowess of the Welsh. The dike helped to preserve the status quo between the Welsh and the English for many centuries, partly helped by the fact that Wales was almost always divided among rival rulers, but the relationship became strained during the reign of the next-to-last Anglo-Saxon king, Edward the Confessor. In 1055, a powerful Welsh ruler named Griffith ap Llywelyn managed to bring all of Wales under his command by methods that were not exactly gentle. Griffith then struck an alliance with a disgruntled former English earl and helped him to raid the English border town of Hereford. It took the English royal forces several campaigns to subdue Griffith, but King Edward's right-hand man, Harold Godwinson, managed to drive him into the far northwest of Wales, where he was ultimately killed. We think, it's not totally clear, by one of his Welsh rivals in 1064. Griffith's death had far-reaching implications. Once he passed from the scene, Wales immediately fell apart into its traditional smaller units, and this meant that 2 years later, when Harold Godwinson, now king, was defeated by William the Conqueror at the Battle of Hastings, Wales was going to meet the new threat, not with a single strong king, but with many weak ones. Despite this political disadvantage for the Welsh, William never fully conquered Wales, partly because he had a lot of other lands to worry about. In fact, much of the campaigning in Wales was actually done not by the kings of England but by their lords, who were mostly interested in carving out estates for themselves that were as far as possible from royal supervision. Over the next century or so, what we see is more of an ebb and flow of Anglo-Norman incursions into Wales, first in the north, and then more successfully in the south. But they were always rolled back the next time a truly powerful Welsh ruler presented himself. This fluid frontier in Wales gave rise to a kind of hybrid society that took a little bit from both the Welsh and the Anglo-Norman sides, and there was plenty of intermarriage. These border areas were known as the Marches of Wales. A march is just a border area. It's where we get the word marquis or margrave from. The Welsh marches could be a rather wild place, since people from both the Welsh and the English areas sometimes disappeared into the marches to escape the notice of their enemies. English kings were always a bit worried about the possibility of rebellions coming out of the marches, but it was a lot cheaper and easier to have their noblemen try to keep order and prevent the Welsh from causing trouble than it was to do it themselves. This very fluid Welsh situation played a huge role in the English invasion of Ireland. So let's turn to that now. In my lecture on the Irish Sea World, I mentioned that by the middle of the 12th century, the Irish political landscape had crystallized somewhat in comparison to an earlier period, when Ireland was ruled by a large number of regional kings. By the mid-12th century, the number of important rulers in Ireland had been whittled down to maybe 4 or 5 at a time, so that was actually a lot of progress. England had also started out divided among many small kingdoms, but by the 12th century, it was incomparably more unified and more powerful than Ireland. The kings of England controlled most of western France, and as we've seen, a significant portion of Wales. When King Henry II took the throne in 1154, there was talk of him invading Ireland as well to kind of round out his portfolio. But there had been a long civil war before he became king, so he decided to concentrate on repairing that damage rather than on new conquests. But in 1155, the Pope, Adrian IV, issued the bull Laudabiliter, which gave the English king the authority to invade Ireland for the purposes of reforming the church. The reason was that the church in Ireland was not exactly conforming to modern standards of discipline and morality. Now, lots of people will point gleefully to the fact that this pope, the one who gave England a free pass to invade Ireland, was the only Englishman ever to sit on the throne of St. Peter. But the bull did not result in an immediate invasion because, as I said, Ireland was not a priority. So the bull just sat there. Now back to some Irish politics. Those 4 or 5 major rulers I talked about a moment ago tended to fall into 2 opposing alliances. In the 1160s, these alliances consisted of the King of Ulster and the King of Leinster on one side, and the King of Connacht and the King of Breffni on the other. But in 1166, the King of Ulster was killed. This was bad news for the King of Leinster, Diarmaid MacMurrough, because he was now out of allies. And apparently he had worked hard at making enemies. One factor may have been a very personal dispute. In 1152, Diarmaid had kidnapped the wife of the King of Breffni, Tigernán O'Rourke, a close ally of Rory O'Connor, King of Connacht, the most powerful ruler in Ireland. Now it turns out that Tigernán's wife, whose name was Dervergel, sort of wanted to be kidnapped. I guess Tigernán had been mistreating her. So sources say that she conspired with Diarmaid to allow the kidnapping to happen. Still, this was a terrible insult to Tigernán. And to make matters worse, the very next year, Diarmaid seems to have gotten tired of Dervergel and let her be recaptured on purpose. So this was a kind of double insult. First you steal my wife, then you don't think she's worth fighting to keep. So Tigernán hated Diarmaid with a passion ever afterwards. There were doubtless other strategic factors involved that are now lost to us. But this was the gossip that chroniclers reported, and it certainly does make a compelling story. In 1166, Tigernán finally got his chance for revenge. He used his influence with Rory O'Connor, King of Connacht, to force Diarmaid into exile. But Diarmaid was a stubborn man. He was about 57 years old at this point, but he was not ready to take defeat gracefully. On his way into exile, Diarmaid stopped off in Lismore in the south of Ireland, where he happened to meet up with a papal representative, who mentioned to him this papal bull that had been gathering dust on a shelf for more than 10 years. So Diarmaid then left Ireland in search of Henry II of England, determined to use Laudabiliter to get access to the English king, because he wanted Henry to help put him back on the throne of Leinster. Diarmaid tracked King Henry down in France where he was campaigning and asked for his help. In exchange, Diarmaid offered to become Henry's vassal. Henry was not interested in becoming personally involved in this matter, but he did give Diarmaid permission to see if any of Henry's vassals would be willing to help out. So Diarmaid finally wound up in Wales, which had some of the fiercest, most unruly Norman vassals around. This was the ideal place to recruit men for a desperate enterprise. And Diarmaid found one, Richard Fitzgilbert de Clare, Lord of Strigul, known to later generations as Strongbow. Dermot offered Strongbow his daughter Aoife in marriage and made him heir to the kingdom of Leinster if he would come to Ireland and help Dermot get Leinster back. Mind you, this would mean disinheriting Dermot's sons, but Dermot saw Strongbow as the best bet to get his kingdom back, so he staked everything on this Norman Welsh lord. Strongbow wasn't ready to move as fast as Dermot wanted him to, so Dermot enlisted some other allies, two half-brothers, Robert Fitzstephen, a Norman baron with close ties also to the Welsh aristocracy, and Robert's half-brother Maurice Fitzgerald. These men became the ancestors of the famous Fitzgerald family in Ireland. They had the further distinction of being the uncles of Gerald of Wales, who later wrote History of the Invasion. The invasion unfolded in a series of expeditions. First a small group of Flemish mercenaries, then the Fitzgeralds, and finally Strongbow himself in 1170, and he brought the largest contingent of soldiers yet, 200 cavalry and 1,000 archers. Within 2 days, Waterford had fallen, and Strongbow finally married Dermot's daughter Aoife in Waterford Cathedral. This marriage between a foreign lord and an Irish princess was a powerful symbol of what the future held for Ireland. The wedding is the subject of a famous painting by Daniel Maclise done in 1854 that now hangs in the National Gallery in Dublin. From this painting, you get a sense, I think, of the interpretation that was later placed on the event by 19th century Irish nationalists. It looks for all the world like an Irish version of the rape of the Sabine women. But the bad news for Strongbow was that King Henry was coming to check up on him. Besides wanting to rein in an unruly vassal, Henry has a second and perhaps even more decisive reason for coming to Ireland. He had a sudden, quite urgent need to look good in the eyes of the church. Why? Because of Henry's complicity in the crime of the century, the murder of Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, in 1170. In the summer of 1171, Henry heard that papal commissioners were on their way to England to issue a condemnation for Becket's murder. It seemed like a good time to get out of town and to be seen to be doing the church's business while he was at it. So Henry invoked laudabiliter at last, and made plans to depart for Ireland with an even larger army than Strongbow had, plus siege equipment. Now, faced with an overwhelming force like this, Strongbow of course submitted. He accepted Henry's terms. Henry then called a church council. Lots of reforming legislation was passed. The bishops of Ireland accepted Henry as overlord. The Pope was gratified, and by September 1172, Henry was officially forgiven for Becket's murder, due in no small part to his Irish expedition. And the secular leaders of Ireland were pretty happy with Henry as well. The petty Irish kings started submitting to him in droves to get grants of their lands. The problem was that Henry and the Irish kings had completely different ideas of what it meant to submit. Henry thought he was making grants of what was already his own property. Laudabiliter had given him rights in Ireland, after all. But the Irish kings only thought that the king was giving them protection against the seizure of their lands by the Norman lords already in Ireland. Henry was claiming more rights in Ireland than the Irish realized, and this fundamental clash would store up trouble for later. Now, if Henry had been able to stay in Ireland, perhaps he would have made good his conquest. Given his quite favorable reception by both church and lay lords, he might have created a unified Irish kingship at last. But as soon as Henry returned to his own lands, war broke out again between the English invaders and the Irish lords. A major problem was that when these two people tried to make treaties with each other, each side had a different conception of what they were agreeing to. And because the two societies had such different presuppositions about family inheritance and lordship, the Anglo-Normans practiced primogeniture, the strict rule that gave the bulk of the family estate to the eldest male heir, and the Irish did not. This caused tremendous problems. We've seen already that the Irish system was quite different. Really, the inheritance went to the person with the strongest party to back him. This was obviously a much more fluid, less reliable system than the Normans were used to. Furthermore, every time the inheritance changed hands, there was not necessarily the assumption that the relationships and agreements that the previous lord had entered into would be kept by the new one. So whereas Anglo-Norman lords were used to making a treaty with one man and then continuing it with his eldest son as a matter of course, the Irish assumed that you would need to negotiate everything all over again. And this drove the Anglo-Normans crazy, as you might imagine. They found the whole Irish political scene impenetrable, at least at first, and they had a very hard time getting their footing. King Henry decided that he would need to reorganize English rule in Ireland, and he decided to set up a lordship there for his youngest son, John, who had been born after all the rest of Henry's vast landholdings had been promised to his older brothers. So John had been nicknamed John Lackland. So this scheme to set him up in Ireland was meant to address that situation. But when John actually went to Ireland in 1185, he made a total mess of the expedition. And the result was that Ireland remained divided among the Irish and the English in a kind of patchwork. There were areas where the English were quite dominant, and others where they were very thin on the ground. But the expedition did produce something important to our story of the encounter between the Irish and the English. Namely, the first anti-Irish propaganda written by an Englishman, or, to be more precise, an Anglo-Welshman, namely Gerald of Wales, who accompanied John on his ill-fated visit to Ireland. Gerald is very interesting because he was himself very much of a cultural hybrid. He wrote about both Wales and Ireland and intended to write about Scotland as well, but he never got around to it. He wrote a reasonably sober account of the invasion, but he also wrote a book called The History and Topography of Ireland that was intended much more for the armchair traveler. It's full of stories about all the wonders you would encounter if you went to Ireland, from talking animals to sacred fires that never go out. Some of these stories are rather lurid. Gerald has an unhealthy obsession with bestiality, for example, but it's certainly arresting, and it was widely read. One of the most interesting aspects of the text is that you see already the genre of stereotyping the Irish and the Welsh as alien others for the benefit of an English audience. Gerald's stereotypes of the Irish would last almost down to the modern period. For example, here is Gerald on the Irish temperament. This seems to me a thing to be noticed, that just as the men of this country are, during this mortal life, more prone to anger and revenge than any other race, so in eternal death, the saints of this land that have been elevated by their merits are more vindictive than the saints of any other region. So, according to Gerald, even Irish holy men are more warlike than other saints. The stereotype of the fighting Irish is born in the 12th century. Now, I have read a lot of medieval saints' lives, and it's not true that Irish saints were meaner than other saints. There were angry saints to be found almost everywhere. Gerald was contemptuous of almost all aspects of Irish life other than their music and art. He clearly thought Ireland was wasted on the Irish. Probably the most notorious passage in all of Gerald's writings about Ireland comes in the History and Topography, where he describes a supposed royal inauguration ritual that takes place in far-off Donegal in the northwest of Ireland. Now, Gerald has not been to Donegal, so he is reporting these details second-hand, if not third or fourth-hand. Gerald claims that in order to be inaugurated, the king of that region must copulate with a mare, after which act the mare is slaughtered, and then the king bathes in a broth made from the unfortunate horse. As you may well imagine, this vivid scene has drawn the prurient attention of readers for over 8 centuries. Let's return for a moment to John and his disastrous visit to Ireland. John had left in disgust, and he would not return to Ireland until 25 years later, in 1210, when he mainly came to punish his own rebellious barons. And after that, no English king returned to Ireland for nearly 200 years. Thus, Henry II's scheme for an Irish kingdom with perhaps a resident monarch came to naught. One of John's few visible achievements was his castle at Limerick, which remained in royal hands, and it has stood the test of time quite well. Another thing John did with very long-lasting implications was to start the process of dividing Ireland into counties. And today, the counties of Ireland are absolutely fundamental to Irish identity. Practically the first question you might ask an Irish person is what county they come from. So ironically, counties are an English import. Just another sign of how much the Celtic areas have been influenced by outside forces over the years. But once John withdrew, the Anglo-Norman settlers were left practically to their own devices to try to expand their holdings at the expense of the Irish. One important step that the settlers took was to construct a network of castles to help them to secure their lands against Irish attacks. These castles grew up somewhat haphazardly in places where the settlers felt able to build them, and they clearly clustered along the east coast. Castles were often initially very modest, but they could grow very large and impressive, as for example at Kilkenny Castle, begun in the late 12th century and then expanded. They also imported settlers from England and Wales in the hopes of recreating the kinds of estates and lordships that they were familiar with at home. What did the Irish make of all of this? Of course, the arrival of so many armed and determined English soldiers had effectively ended any hopes that the Irish would develop their own unified kingdom. Irish politics were not merely fractured. Due to the various encroachments of the Anglo-Norman lords, even provincial kingships vanished. And we must remember that the small lordships that remained among the Irish were still not really territorial entities, but rather networks of relationships, all of which were extremely fluid. At the top was the over-king and his family, any one of whom might be in rebellion against him at any given time. Underneath were the chiefs, some of whom were descended from formerly semi-autonomous minor kings. They controlled their own kinsmen and clients under them, and these were notoriously unreliable. It was always a matter of suspense whether they would turn out when summoned. Now, into these fluid networks, the Anglo-Norman lords, or even agents of the English crown, happily inserted themselves. Just as the Vikings had been absorbed into local Irish politics, these newcomers also made alliances with the Irish. And just as with the Vikings, the Irish did not have any scruples about using the newcomers to score points against their own Irish rivals. Now, why didn't the Irish simply band together to beat back the settlers? It seems that they were always too worried about their rivals making alliances with the settlers, so it made sense to make their own best deal with the newcomers before their enemies did. So why didn't this work out as well as it had with the Vikings, who after all were ultimately absorbed into Irish society? The problem was that the English had a very different attitude to grants of land. They were meant to be perpetual, and once you put castles on them, it was hard to get rid of them. So when the Irish thought they were making a clever alliance to meet the political contingencies of the moment, they were actually letting in men who would not be so easily contained or sent packing when they were no longer useful. As a result, the Anglo-Norman lords, who had sometimes been installed in fact with Irish backing, became often not tools of the Irish, but the dominant players in local politics. They actually took the place of the old over-kings. Of course, in theory, the Irish lords could appeal to the English king. The problem was that the Irish lords usually had even less luck than the settler lords in getting the English king to pay attention to them. So often, they were just stuck making the best deal they could with the settlers. Since the Anglo-Irish lords felt increasingly that they were on their own, they figured that if it was up to them to protect their own estates, they would use whatever methods seemed best to them. Many times, this meant adapting to local conditions and adopting Irish forms of warfare and the use of Irish law, and of course, the use of the Irish language. We'll get back to that in a moment. First, I want to mention another big factor that can help to explain the dramatic changes in the balance of power in Ireland that helped the native Irish inhabitants and hurt the English colonists, the Black Death. The Black Death spread throughout Europe and reached Ireland in 1348, first in the southeast and then spreading to the north and west, but it was disproportionately severe in the towns, which is where the English live. So the impact was much worse for the settlers than for the native Irish. You started, in fact, to see people giving up and moving back to England. By the late 14th century, there were laws passed trying to stop English settlers from returning, and also trying to force English settlers who had already moved back to England to go back to Ireland, because there simply weren't enough people of English blood to man the defenses of the colony. It must have seemed for a moment there as if the English problem in Ireland would take care of itself because the English would all leave. The kings of England were certainly aware of the problem. Ireland went from providing revenue to being a net drain on the English treasury. So in 1361, King Edward III had his son, Lionel, marry the heiress to the earldom of Ulster, and he sent Lionel to Ireland to rule on his behalf. Lionel did his best, but he was horrified by the degeneracy he found. The English settlers were acting like Irishmen. So he called a parliament at Kilkenny to try to address the problem. And this parliament produced the notorious Statutes of Kilkenny in 1366. It helps to know some background here of what was going on in the rest of the English world. For most of the 14th century and then half of the 15th century, England was at war with France. And during these struggles with France, English national identity developed to a degree not seen before. Until then, French had been the language of the English court. It was the prestige language, the cultivated language. But now, English replaced French. Lines of ethnic identity were being increasingly sharply drawn. As a result, the English in Ireland grew very nervous about the ways in which some among them had begun to assimilate to the Irish way of life. So the statutes that were passed in 1366 were aimed not at the Irish. That is a common misconception about them. They were aimed at the English in Ireland to try to get them to stay English and not go completely native. They first of all ordered that the Anglo-Irish, that is, the people who had been settled in Ireland for generations, should not be treated any differently from Englishmen who had just arrived in the country. It's quite clear from this that such distinctions were in fact being drawn, and we even know what insults were being used by each side against the other. The Irish would call the newcomers English hob, and the English would call the Irish Irish dog. And this tended to drive a further wedge between the two segments of the English community. Then there's a whole list of Irish things the English aren't allowed to do. The Anglo-Irish were ordered to speak only English among themselves. The law thus recognized the necessity of speaking Irish when dealing with Irish neighbors, but they did not want any use of Irish when it wasn't strictly necessary for such a practical purpose. Along the same lines, the Anglo-Irish were not to use Irish names, either first names or Irish-style surnames. They were not supposed to ride horses in the Irish style, that is, bareback with no stirrups. They were not supposed to get Irish haircuts which were shaved on top and long in the back, looking sort of like a mullet. And one of my favorites, the Anglo-Irish were not to have Irish musicians and storytellers perform in their halls, because everyone knew how much sheer Irishness these people managed to get across. There was thus supposed to be a cultural wall between Irish and English that would seal the two ethnic groups off from each other. However, some English settlers in Ireland became so enamored of Irish culture that they not only learned the Irish language but even wrote poetry in Irish. In fact, the third Earl of Desmond, Gerald Fitzgerald, who was alive at the time of the statutes, wrote quite good Irish poetry. Now, since the statutes are aimed squarely at the Anglo-Irish, they can obscure the fact that acculturation was a two-way street. You could find some great hybrid names in 14th century Ireland among the Irish. These are actual people. Edmund O'Kennedy, Henry O'Neill. Now, you don't get much more English than Edmund, for goodness sake. The Irish also had no problem sending their children to settler families for fosterage. And notice that this very key Irish social institution is now uniting the two groups. The problem with the statutes was that they assumed that if you could change the language people spoke and the way they cut their hair or didn't cut it, you would change the political realities on the ground. In fact, though, a lot of assimilation on the part of the Anglo-Irish was really an effort to survive in an increasingly precarious environment. One of the provisions of the statutes was that the Anglo-Irish should not use Irish law to settle disputes. But what were you supposed to do if you lived in an area where that was the only law available? The statutes were thus trying to legislate about hair and saddles and other such things, when the real problem was the lack of infrastructure that could support an English-style government. But it's a lot cheaper to ban Irish haircuts than to provide the resources to garrison the countryside. And it's important to keep in mind that however much the government wanted to make distinctions, there was no hard and fast line between English and Irish. Cultural assimilation did not always make the settlers forget who their ancestors were, but even within a single family there were wide variations in practice. In 1371 to 1372, John, son of William le Poer, went to jail under the statutes for knowing no English. He was released when an older family member promised he would learn. We notice then that there are bilingual family members because obviously, if this guy John knows no English, he is speaking to the rest of his family in Irish. So where does that leave the Anglo-Irish? They think of themselves as English, their political allegiance is English, but they look and act Irish, which makes the real English suspect their loyalty. They want more help from England, but they're often dissatisfied with the help that they are sent. They're in a very ambivalent situation, and it's not going to get any better until the Tudor government in the 16th century decides to resolve the Irish question once and for all. Last time, we talked about the English invasions of Wales and Ireland. In this lecture, I'd like to tell the story of Scotland from about the 11th century to the early 14th century. I will overlap here with my lecture on the Irish Sea world that focuses on the encounter between the Scandinavians and the Celtic-speaking peoples from the 8th to the 15th centuries. Here, though, I will focus in a more concentrated way on the story of the creation of the Kingdom of Scotland, and we'll look at the role that ethnicity played in that process, particularly Celtic ethnicity. Along the way, we'll look at some of the most intriguing figures in Scottish history: Macbeth, Sir William Wallace, and Robert the Bruce. Let's recap a little before we get started. Scotland had been open to many influences over the years. You have the Celtic-speaking Picts in the northeast and the Celtic-speaking Britons in the southwest. You have the Germanic-speaking Angles in the southeast and the Germanic-speaking Scandinavians in the far north and the western islands. And everywhere else you have the Celtic-speaking Gaels, who trace their cultural lineage to Ireland. So by the 9th century, Scotland is very multi-ethnic and very multilingual. It's a rather complicated picture. But then we get some streamlining. In the 9th and 10th centuries, there's an amalgamation between the areas of Pictish influence and the areas of Irish influence, and they ended up creating a unitary Scottish kingdom in the heartland of what later became Scotland, from the central belt between Edinburgh and Glasgow up north into the Highlands. The losers in this process seem to have been the Picts, in the sense that their language and culture died out. But remember, this doesn't necessarily mean that anything terrible happened to the people. They probably just adopted a Gaelic identity. As we have seen repeatedly in this course, that kind of shift in cultural and linguistic identity has happened many times in the story of the Celtic world. Exactly how this happened, we're not sure. Later written sources place this consolidation of the Picts and the Scots during the reign of Kenneth MacAlpin, who supposedly reigned from 810 to 858. This newly consolidated kingdom slowly but surely absorbed the British kingdoms in the southwest, in the Glasgow region and in Galloway, and forced the English and the Scandinavians out. This process took many centuries and it was rather messy. Not everybody in Scotland really wanted there to be one powerful Scottish king, and even those who did believe in a unified kingdom often disagreed very strongly about who should rule it. Enter the figure I want to begin with, Macbeth. Macbeth is certainly a famous figure due to Shakespeare's play, but I want to talk about him here because he is a perfect example of how Celtic sensibilities came to seem alien to later people who had been influenced by English political and cultural norms. Macbeth was a very Celtic ruler, but he was stigmatized later as a villain in order to make the Scottish ruling house look less Celtic and thus less barbaric. Macbeth was born around 1005 into this newly consolidated Scottish kingdom that was both facing enemies on its periphery and frequently torn by internal conflict. The main reason for the turmoil was the Scottish system of succession to the throne, which was common to other parts of the Celtic-speaking world. In 11th century Scotland, the rules were quite loose. You needed to be related to the previous king. Ideally, you would be his oldest son, but the most important factor was not your exact position in the royal genealogy. It was your competence to rule, and that was determined very much by whether you could project an image of strength to your followers. Therefore, every time a king died, the question of who would succeed him was up for debate, and usually up for dispute. It was quite common to have conflicts that pitted an uncle against a nephew, a brother against a brother, or a cousin against a cousin. So keep in mind that succession disputes in Macbeth's period were not unusual, they were normal. So let's look at the events of Macbeth's life. He was born, as I said, in 1005. He was probably the grandson of King Malcolm II through his mother, and his father was the ruler of Moray, an important territory in the north of Scotland. When King Malcolm died in 1034, the kingdom went to another grandson, Duncan, the son of King Malcolm's daughter, Befoc. Duncan and Macbeth were probably fairly close in age. Duncan ruled for 6 years, and then he was killed by Macbeth. But not as we see in Shakespeare's play. It's not a cold-blooded murder. In fact, Macbeth killed Duncan in battle. Macbeth was merely pursuing his own claim to the throne. Furthermore, that battle took place on Macbeth's home turf. Duncan had invaded Macbeth's territory in the north because Macbeth had become a threat to him. He must have been making noises about claiming the throne himself, and Duncan was trying to head him off at the pass, so to speak. So the two cousins fought each other for control of Scotland, and Macbeth won, fair and square. By the rules of the 11th century, he did nothing unusual, let alone wrong. According to our sources, Macbeth then ruled relatively successfully for 17 years, which is not what it seems like in the play. In fact, Macbeth was so secure on the throne that in 1050, 10 years into his reign, he actually went on pilgrimage to Rome, where he distributed alms to the poor. That was a big deal in the 11th century to leave your kingdom for months at a time, but Macbeth felt able to leave the kingdom in the capable hands of his wife, Gruach, and that was her name. Maybe Shakespeare lost heart at the thought of a character named Gruach and just went with Lady Macbeth. One annal reports that the poor were well taken care of in Scotland during Macbeth's reign. This does not sound very much like the bloody tyrant we know from the play, does it? Ultimately, though, Macbeth lost the kingdom just as he had gained it, in battle with a rival, Malcolm III, son of Duncan, whose nickname was Malcolm Canmore. That means big head. There's the word Cain for head that we encountered when I talked about the Celtic languages. The nickname Canmore is probably a reference not to the actual size of Malcolm's head, but to his leadership abilities. Malcolm had grown up in exile in the south in England, and he enlisted the help of the Northumbrian Earl Seward, who was his uncle, in his campaign against Macbeth. The combined Northumbrian and Scottish army did in fact meet up with Macbeth at Dunsinane, and they defeated Macbeth's army there, but that was actually not the end of the story. Macbeth retreated further north, and they did not catch up with him until several years later when he was finally slain. It took another year, however, for Malcolm to establish himself on the throne, because Macbeth was briefly succeeded by his stepson, Lula, the son of Grua, by a prior marriage. Now, soon after Macbeth was killed, he was virtually forgotten, and he remained obscure for about 300 years. It's not until the 14th century that there was a sudden upsurge of interest in Macbeth. I'll return to Macbeth at the end of the lecture. But Malcolm Canmore does succeed in establishing a more or less stable dynasty, and Malcolm's reign marks the beginning of a period of English influence in Scotland that profoundly shaped the creation of the Scottish kingdom, and ultimately helped to dilute the Celtic elements in Scottish politics and culture. So where did the English influence over the Scottish court come from? I already mentioned that Malcolm had regained his throne with the help of his uncle, Earl Seward of Northumbria, and that indicates that Scotland and England were by no means sealed off from each other in this period. In fact, they were always interconnected, even if they were frequently at war. For many centuries, England and Scotland harbored each other's exiles. And if England had sheltered the Scottish exile, Malcolm, then Scotland was about to shelter a famous family of English exiles, through which English mores and then Anglo-Norman mores would have a profound impact on Scotland. I'm going to make a rather extended digression here into English history, but I promise that it will relate very directly to Scotland. Most people have of course heard of the Norman conquest of England in 1066. A less well-known aspect of this conquest is the fact that even after the English king, Harold Godwinson, was killed at the Battle of Hastings, there was a royal English claimant who survived. This claimant was named Edgar Atheling. He was descended from the Anglo-Saxon royal family, but he and his two sisters had grown up in exile on the European continent. He was brought back to England in his early teens a few years before the conquest. Now, Edgar was apparently not a terribly imposing figure. When King Harold died at Hastings, and William began his devastating march towards London, Edgar's supporters rather quickly rushed to meet the conqueror and offer him submission, and Edgar was forced to follow suit. But within a few years, Edgar's resolve stiffened, and he ended up in Scotland at the court of Malcolm Canmore looking for an ally. King Malcolm agreed to marry one of Edgar's sisters, Margaret, and to support Edgar's bid for the English throne. It's very probable that part of the deal would have been a promise that Scotland would receive territory in northern England in return for this assistance. It didn't work out well for Edgar. William was a formidable adversary, and Malcolm paid a heavy price for supporting Edgar. Malcolm had to acknowledge William's overlordship and expel Edgar from Scotland. So Edgar duly went into exile. He had many hair-raising adventures, but he seems to have had 9 lives and died in his bed at the age of 75, never having become King of England. The important thing for our purposes, though, is the marriage between Edgar's sister Margaret and King Malcolm. This marriage was long and lasting, and in fact, the two spouses were so devoted to each other that when Margaret learned of Malcolm's death in battle in 1093, she died herself 3 days later, supposedly of grief. She was renowned for her piety and was canonized in 1250 by the Catholic Church. Now, since Edgar Atheling never married, and his other sister Christina became a nun, Queen Margaret of Scotland represented the true line of the Anglo-Saxon royal house. So in 1100, William the Conqueror's youngest son, Henry, who had just taken the English throne as Henry I, decided to unite the old Anglo-Saxon claim to the Norman claim with his own by marrying the daughter of Queen Margaret and Malcolm Canmore, Princess Edith. Edith was then renamed Matilda so that the French-speaking Normans could pronounce her name. So why does this digression into English history matter in a lecture about Scotland? It's because the newly renamed Matilda, the half-Scottish, half-Anglo-Saxon Queen of England, invited her younger brother David to hang out at the English court. And while he was there, he became thoroughly Normanized. He absorbed some of the practices that we loosely refer to as feudalism, and he ultimately brought them back to Scotland with him, where, due to the unexpected early deaths of all of his older brothers, he became King of Scotland in 1124 and ruled for nearly 30 years. David admired the Anglo-Norman knights he met at the English court, and in fact, his royal seal depicts him very much as an Anglo-Norman knight. So he invited many of these knights to Scotland and gave them lands and titles, and these knights founded many of the great families of Scotland, including two families that would later produce royal Scottish dynasties, the Bruce family, who were originally from Normandy, and the Stuart family, who came from Brittany, and thus, ironically, English culture came to Scotland via another Celtic region. Some of these families assimilated very well into the existing Gaelic-speaking aristocracy of Scotland. But this Anglo-Norman element helped to make French, and later the Scots language, which was closely related to English, more prestigious than Gaelic. And that is one reason why Scots became the country's dominant language rather than Gaelic. So King David was a very anglicized or Normanized Gaelic king of Scotland, and this trend continued over the next century and a half. Scottish kings worked rather ruthlessly to implement English-style primogeniture in the Scottish royal house. No more cousins fighting for the throne as a matter of course. So eager were the kings to stamp out alternate lines of the royal house that in 1229, an infant girl from a junior branch of the family called the MacWilliams had her brains dashed out against the column of the market cross of the town of Forfar. Although Scotland and England certainly had their ups and downs during this period, most of the 13th century was peaceful enough until the Scottish royal family underwent a dynastic catastrophe in 1286, when King Alexander III died, leaving only a granddaughter who promptly died as well. Now, under the old Celtic conditions of Macbeth's day, there would have just been an old-fashioned civil war to decide which of the 13 throne-worthy men who presented themselves should become king. But the Scots had now become accustomed to following Anglo-Norman-style dynastic rules, so they called in King Edward I of England to mediate among the claimants, who argued their cases based not on competence, but on genealogy, although it must be said that the strength of their followings was surely a factor in the background all along. Now, of course, asking King Edward of England to choose the King of Scotland was a bit like asking the cat to choose the king of the mice. He wasn't exactly going to pick the most formidable candidate. He instead chose John Balliol, another scion of a northern French family, instead of a more popular candidate named Robert de Bruce or Robert Bruce, who was likewise of mixed Anglo-Norman and Celtic ancestry. Balliol was largely unable to stand up to King Edward's efforts to dominate Scotland, and he lost support quickly among the Scottish nobles, who nicknamed him Tomb Tabard. A tabard is a kind of outer garment, and tomb means empty, so they were basically calling the king an empty suit. John Balliol finally did man up, so to speak, and defy Edward, but by then it was too late, and in 1296 Edward marched north, defeated Balliol, and took him captive. Along with the captive king, Edward removed the coronation stone of the Scottish kings from Scone Abbey and installed it at Westminster Abbey, as if to say, Scottish sovereignty is now at an end. We're now up to the events that are rather loosely depicted in the film Braveheart. Let me lay my cards on the table. I am not a huge fan of this film, though I think there are some fascinating aspects to it. The hero of the film is a real historical figure named Sir William Wallace, played by Mel Gibson, who nearly single-handedly takes on the English oppressors of Scotland. And incidentally, Wallace's last name is related to the word Welsh, and it indicates that he probably came from a family in southwestern Scotland that were originally British-speaking. So he represented a late survival of the Celtic population of southern Scotland. Now, there are a lot of problems in Braveheart, but it is true that Wallace did make life very difficult for the English in Scotland for nearly a decade. He defeated them at Stirling Bridge in 1297, though the battle is nothing like what you see in the movie, and he was named Guardian of Scotland. But finally, in 1305, he was captured and executed in a very gruesome fashion, and in fact the real execution is even worse than we see in the movie, so I will skip the details. At the same time, though, another Robert Bruce, the grandson of the unsuccessful claimant for back in the early 1290s, took over the leadership of the Scottish resistance to English rule after murdering yet another claimant to the throne, and he went on to defeat the English at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, and Scotland maintained its independence from England for almost 3 more centuries, and only became part of Britain in 1603 by a dynastic accident when Queen Elizabeth I died without heirs and left the kingdom to her cousin, James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. Before I leave Braveheart, I will just point out a couple of its many historical inaccuracies, and I'll confine myself to ones that are directly relevant to the Celtic aspect of Scottish history, because both of them play on modern views of the Celts. In the film, we see lowland Scots wearing tartan cloth, which, as we'll see in a later lecture, is characteristic of the Highlands. The filmmakers seem to think that if we don't see tartan, we won't believe we're in Scotland. William Wallace and his fellow soldiers are also wearing very improbably bright blue war paint, about 1,000 years after the Picts supposedly did so. But again, enough people know about the blue war paint that when we see it in the movie theater, we believe we are in Scotland. There's one more distortion in the film that I find particularly intriguing because it illustrates the pervasive modern view that all Celtic countries are intimately connected to each other. About halfway through the film, we are introduced to the character of Stephen, played by David Patrick O'Hara, Irishman, who rather randomly joins Wallace's merry band of Scottish patriots. This character is entirely invented. Stephen is really there to give the Irish Americans in the audience a dog in its fight. In another sign of pandering to the Irish element, there was a scene in which King Edward describes his plan for an invasion of Scotland. In describing his forces, he refers to the levies from England and Wales, and then he is very careful to refer to his Irish troops as Irish conscripts. It's very important that nobody believe for an instant that any Irish soldier would willingly fight against the Scots. That would mean violating some sort of Celtic solidarity. Now, in actual fact, the Irish troops who fought in Scotland were there on the same terms as any of the other troops, but this distinction between the Irish and the other troops is made in the film in order to set up one of the most famous scenes when the English commanders send their Irish conscripts into battle against the Scots, first as a sort of cannon fodder. But of course, the Irish troops immediately switch sides and fight on behalf of the Scots, their Celtic brethren. This is, of course, complete nonsense. Mel Gibson is trying to create a kind of fake pan-Celtic nationalism that resists the oppression of the evil English Empire. Still, what's intriguing is, despite the fact that the movie's historical inaccuracies were widely recognized and discussed in Scotland at the time, Braveheart has taken on a political salience. There is little doubt that support for Scottish independence has gotten at least a small boost from the movie. There is actually a tiny bit of truth, though, to the idea of a Celtic alliance at the time of Robert Bruce. Bruce knew he was locked in a life-and-death struggle to maintain Scottish independence, and he reached out for allies wherever he could find them. There is some evidence that he was trying from early on in his reign to create an alliance with Ireland and Wales. He wrote a letter to the Irish kings in 1306 in which he specifically referred to the common ancestry of the Irish and the Scots. But of course, he did not use the term Celtic. And in 1315, the year after his big victory at the Battle of Bannockburn, Bruce tried to bring such an alliance about. He clearly saw a Scottish invasion of Ireland as a way to cut off the supply of Irish troops and taxes to the English army. Robert Bruce knew Ireland well because his late wife had been the daughter of the Earl of Ulster. In addition, before he became King of Scotland, he spent time hiding out on Rathlin Island off the coast of Ulster. Then, around the time of Bannockburn, Robert Bruce was approached by Donald O'Neill, an Irish ruler who wanted help against the Earl of Ulster, Robert's former father-in-law. The O'Neills were the most illustrious native family in Ireland. They were descended from the famous Niall of the Nine Hostages and had once ruled most of the northern half of Ireland. Now they were confined to the western part of the province of Ulster. In 1315, in response to O'Neill's plea, Robert Bruce sent his brother, Edward Bruce, to Ireland. It's not clear whether he was trying to create an actual satellite kingdom or merely to cause a diversion, but at any rate, in May of 1315, Edward landed in Ulster and many Irish leaders flocked to join him. He set up his base in Ulster and then he raided the Midlands and the South. Edward also participated in a ritual of royal inauguration, though not, I hasten to add, along the lurid lines described in the 12th century by Gerald of Wales. So Edward was claiming to be, and he was acknowledged by many to be, King of Ireland. Edward had some successes. He did defeat the Earl of Ulster in the field. He captured the imposing castle of Carrickfergus, the great fortress of the Earls of Ulster. But he could not capture Dublin, so he still could not operate consistently outside of his initial power base in Ulster. Reports of this general lack of progress went home to Scotland, and in 1317, Robert Bruce decided to come in person to try to jumpstart the invasion. Together, the brothers moved south on Dublin, but the city resisted. So they bypassed Dublin and moved south into Munster, where they went up against an Anglo-Irish army, which included one faction of the famous O'Brien family, who were mainly opposing the Bruces because another faction of the O'Briens was backing them. So, as we can see, local Irish rivalries got mapped onto the conflict and led to stalemate, and the Bruces were forced to retreat back to Ulster. Robert was then needed back in Scotland, so he went home, and one guesses he left with some feelings of relief to be shot of the whole quagmire, or perhaps we should say, bog. For a year and a half, Edward Bruce basically sat there in Ulster, bottled up, unable to do much of anything. During this period of stalemate in 1317, Donald O'Neill drafted an important document called the Remonstrance of the Princes. It was sent by the Irish princes to Pope John XXII. The remonstrance came about because the Irish lords had a public relations problem. Officially, they were rebels. From the perspective of the rest of Europe, including the Church, the Irish princes were supposed to be subjects of the King of England. But now they had switched allegiance and accepted Edward Bruce as king. How could they justify defying the terms of the papal bull Laudabiliter, which had authorized the English invasion of Ireland back in the 12th century? Well, the Remonstrance tries to explain, and in effect it tries to have it both ways. First, it denies that Laudabiliter is valid. This was a risky strategy because, face it, it is not easy to get a pope to overturn something that his predecessor did. For our purposes, though, the more interesting aspect of this remonstrance is the fact that it draws heavily on one of our favorite texts, the Book of Invasions, the amalgam of origin myths about the Irish that dates back in some form at least to the 8th century. The Irish princes in the remonstrance cite their descent from the Milesians of Spain and thus deny that England has any authority over them. They're clearly making this a usable past. What is the result of the remonstrance? Nothing. The Pope ignored it. and the rebel princess were in fact later excommunicated. Finally, in the fall of 1318, fed up with the situation, Edward Bruce decided on a last big throw of the dice. He moved south again and came to battle at Faughart, near Dundalk on the coast, right on what is now the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. But he was defeated and died in the battle, and that was the end of the Bruce invasion. It failed for many reasons, but one of the most important was the fact that there was no real pan-Celtic alliance. There wasn't even a pan-Irish alliance. Edward Bruce had a powerful ally in Donald O'Neill, but Donald could not speak for the lords of the rest of Ireland. They saw no reason automatically to back this invader. Wherever there was a faction fight within Ireland, the factions would split into pro-Bruce and anti-Bruce parties, and that division doomed the invasion. But the Bruce invasion of Ireland probably had a direct impact on one of the most important documents in Scottish history, the famous Declaration of Arbroath, which was written in 1320, only 3 years after the remonstrance of the Irish princes. It, too, was directed at the Pope to explain the fact that the Scots were supporting their king, Robert Bruce, who had been excommunicated for murdering his rival for the throne back in 1306. The Declaration of Arbroath starts by explaining the proud heritage of the Scots, leading all the way back to Spain, and before that to the Mediterranean and to Scythia. All of this is borrowed directly from the Irish Book of Invasions, so it's highly likely that the Irish and Scottish intellectuals had been talking to each other about the best way to project an image of independence to the Pope. The Declaration of Arbroath, however, was more successful than the remonstrance of the Irish princes, since Pope John XXII did eventually lift Robert Bruce's excommunication. So in these two documents, we do see a consciousness of common descent for the Irish and the Scots, even though it is being claimed by a Scottish royal family that is only partly Celtic by ancestry. But we also see that Scotland has been brought into the dynastic norms of the wider European society. And that is what brings me finally back to Macbeth. In the wake of the Wars of Independence against England, there was an explosion of Scottish historical writing. In around 1375, a long poem was written in Scots to commemorate the achievements of Robert Bruce. About 100 years later, another poem was written by somebody calling himself Blind Harry, about the deeds of William Wallace. This is a far less factual account than the Bruce poem, and it served as the basis for the novel that eventually turned into the film Braveheart. At the same time, a number of Scottish authors decided that it was important to tell the whole story of Scottish history from the beginning. And where they didn't have a lot of details, say, for the reign of Macbeth, they made them up. But they did so for very specific purposes. In the case of Macbeth, it was useful to go back to the last place where there was a major dynastic break and paint the loser in a bad light and the winner in a good light. So Macbeth is no longer simply the winner in an ordinary faction fight, the long-lived patron of the poor, but rather the usurper who murders children. So the rules got changed on Macbeth 300 years after he died. He would have been very surprised to come back to life in the late 14th century and realize that his reputation had been trashed. In fact, it got worse and worse over time as each generation of Scottish writers developed the legend of Macbeth, adding the witches and all sorts of other nefarious elements to the story. Shakespeare's Macbeth was nearly all created by the Scots themselves. So I suppose one irony of Scottish history in the Middle Ages is how complicated the relationship was between Celtic tradition and the English world that the Scots were always forced to confront, sometimes willingly, as in the case of the borrowing of Anglo-Norman noble expertise, but sometimes not, as in the interference at the time of the Wars of Independence. A case in point, one of the most famous works by that quintessentially English writer, William Shakespeare, written for the first Scottish king of England, is known as the Scottish Play. Thank you for walking these ancient paths with us tonight. If you're still awake, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video so we can keep creating quiet stories for curious minds. Rest well, and remember there's always more. History waiting just beyond the horizon. This has been the Sleepless Historian. Good night.